This is Notes on Quotes. I'm Stephen Harrison, and the premise of this show is I'm simply talking to really interesting people about a quotation that's meaningful to them. People like my guest today, Scott Bradlee. Now, you might not recognize Scott Bradlee's name, but he's the founder of Postmodern Jukebox, and in Postmodern Jukebox, I can almost guarantee that you've seen some of his YouTube videos, because what he does in Postmodern Jukebox is he takes really popular songs and converts them into an old jazz or vintage or ragtime or doo-wop music style. So, for example, one of his huge viral hits was converting the song Creep by Radiohead into an old school jazz style, or taking something by Lady Gaga and putting it into this New Orleans Gatsby style jazz. And it's really cool. It's very transformative work, and it's actually hugely popular. I mean, since 2013, Scott Bradlee and his band Postmodern Jukebox have gotten over 1.2 billion YouTube views. And he also has 4 million subscribers on YouTube. So he's huge and made it totally big time. He does now performances on all 6 continents and tours the world every year with his band, Postmodern Jukebox, doing what he loves, which is this jazz music performance. He also does something like 300 shows per year. So it's really popular stuff. He's built this like huge community of fans that really love him and the way he kind of does this interesting jazz style work and taking pop songs and converting them into jazz. But one of the things I wanted to talk to Scott a little bit more about in this episode is sort of that period before he hit it big, because I was thinking a lot about that period of life when he was a struggling jazz musician. That really difficult period is something that he actually writes about in his recent 2018 memoir, which is called Outside the Jukebox: How I Turned My Vintage Music Obsession into My Dream Gig. And in that book, he talks a lot about performing at wedding cocktail hours where no one's listening to him, or having to get really behind on his rent payments, or like the crushing student loan debt that he had after graduating from this fancy music school. I thought it was very relatable stuff, and I kind of like to hear about how he got through that challenging period in order to like hit it big. And as you know, I always try to pick a quote by someone else that I think kind of exemplifies the guest that I have on the show. And so my quote about Scott Bradlee comes from Kristin Chenoweth. She's the famous Broadway star, and she, of course, originated the role of Glinda in the musical Wicked. And Kristin Chenoweth read Scott Bradlee's recent book, Outside the Jukebox, and she said that the book was, quote, candid, hilarious, and wildly fun. It's the book I wish I'd had when I was getting my start in theater. Now, I personally didn't pursue a career in theater, but I kind of thought that some of the same principles apply to writing and the creative life. I really enjoyed Scott's book. And I would say out of all the guests that we've had so far on the show, or that I've interviewed so far for the show, I think Scott's quote is a very perfect fit for him. It's a perfect fit because he picked another musician just like himself. It's a really good quote. You'll have to hear it. And also the quote itself fits Scott's life story perfectly and his trajectory from kind of being a struggling jazz musician to kind of hitting it big with the hugely popular Postmodern Jukebox. Hey, before we get started, please subscribe to the Notes on Quotes podcast, and please leave us a review. You can follow the show's Instagram at Notes on Quotes, and you can follow me, Stephen Harrison, on Twitter and other social media channels. If you're interested, you can read some of my writing in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Slate. And don't forget, you can read the print versions of all of these interviews at notesonquotes.com. And with that, enjoy the show. Scott Bradlee, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Stephen.
Okay, so what quote are we chatting about today?
All right, so I found, this is one that always resonated with me. This is a Miles Davis quote, and I'm a musician, so Miles Davis, he's one of the guys, and his quote was, "Man, sometimes it takes you a long time to sound like yourself." At first glance, when you kind of see it, it sounds almost like a Yogi Berraism. It's kind of like this paradoxical quote. On the other hand, it also seems overly simplistic. It seems like just be yourself or something like that, that your parents or your teachers tell you. But there's really, when you pick it apart, there's a lot of things going on in that quote. And I think it really speaks to a universal truth about being an artist and the process you go through to, finding what your art is. And I know it definitely applied to me. When I was a kid, I was really into jazz and ragtime, all these kind of seemingly random, types of music that for a 12-year-old to listen to. But it was the music that really spoke to me, more so than the pop music of my time. And, I got to high school and I started kind of experimenting with other genres of music that my friends liked a lot, rock, rap, all kinds of other stuff. And, deep down, I really enjoy this kind of New Orleans jazz and, all that 1920s stuff and 1930s swing band stuff. But I was pretty open-minded. So, I would kind of experiment with all these different genres of music. And then after that, I had somehow convinced myself that it was impossible to, make a living as a ragtime pianist. There were very few people that were doing it. So I kind of, put that stuff aside, and I started just experimenting with all these different genres of music. I mean, I did everything like, I made a rap album when I was like, 17 years old, I went to school for jazz, the kind of the more modern jazz, the stuff that you were more likely to encounter if you were in a major city and you were going to a jazz club. And then I experimented with all these different genres. Even I had a fake British new wave band in college that it was called Gordon Hunting Rocks, but I said it with a British accent. So it was Gordon Hunting and the Wandering Rocks. I tried all these different things, like tried to do like a hipster type of indie rock thing. And finally moved to New York City, and I had this, music degree, and I was a jazz pianist. I labeled myself a jazz pianist, and I tried to go to all the different jam sessions, and I tried to go to all the different jazz clubs and do all the things that you do as a jazz musician. And I just wasn't having any success. Nobody really cared what I was doing. I wasn't really getting booked. I wasn't getting hired, and it was pretty hard to pay my rent. It was kind of I hit a crossroads where I was like, well, this is not really the life and music that I had anticipated or that I wanted. So I got to figure out, an alternative. I got to either go back to school or find some kind of other career. And that's when I discovered YouTube. And, I saw all these people were putting things on YouTube, and it was a lot of, I guess, kind of weird stuff. Like it was a lot of early memes and stuff, and people doing all these things that went viral. And I thought it was really fascinating. And I didn't think at all, I didn't think that it was a professional thing in any way. At the time, I was probably, I probably felt I was too good for YouTube, because I was like, I have a music degree. Why would I go? Like, there's all these people recording in their kitchen and stuff. And then it kind of dawned on me. It's like, well, I'm not really working as a jazz musician, so I'm not really professional in that sense. So, what have I got to lose? So I started putting out some content on YouTube. And the first thing that I did was I recorded, something that I would have done back when I was in high school, which was take a whole bunch of 80s songs like Bon Jovi and Madonna and stuff and turn them into ragtime. And I recorded it, super low budget. I had like one of those flip cameras. It was like before they had those cheap camcorders. I put it online and it went viral. And more people watched that video in a single day than had seen me play my whole life up until that point. So I was pretty excited by this. I was like, there's something there. I wasn't sure what it was. I didn't really know how to monetize or take next steps or anything like that. But I was sure that there was a kernel of something that worked in there. And for whatever reason, people were talking about it. People were giving me suggestions in the comments. People were writing other songs that I should try to kind of turn into ragtime. And this was really exciting to me because I had never had anybody be that interested in what I was doing musically. So I just decided to kind of explore that. And it was kind of weird because up until that point, I was really convinced in my own head that, this kind of ragtime stuff that I was doing or this older styles of jazz, that it wasn't marketable at all, to the point that, I submitted like a demo of me doing some of my ragtime stuff to a booking agent in New York City. And they just wrote back like, man, nobody wants to hear this kind of stuff. Like, can you just stick to the standards? It was kind of like at that moment that I kind of saw things in a very different way. And I realized that, well, maybe my instincts when I was younger was, maybe I should just kind of pursue what I'm really authentically interested in and just give that a shot and see where it goes. And that's what I did. And that's kind of how that eventually turned into Postmodern Jukebox, that eventually turned into world tours and, millions of YouTube subscribers, which is still crazy to me.
And you're in Nashville right now. I'm wondering if, the 12-year-old who liked doing those vintage music covers might be pretty proud of your success right now.
Yeah, I think my 12-year-old self would definitely have been proud that I was featured in Nintendo Power magazine. When I did like an early ragtime version of Mario Brothers or something, and my younger self would be stoked about that.
Scott, can you tell us a little bit about Miles Davis? I take it because you selected this quote that you're a big fan of his.
Yeah, definitely. He's one of those hugely influential jazz musicians not just because of his technical ability or his composition skill, but just because he was just so authentically himself. And I mean, whatever interested him, he just went for it. I mean, he started as kind of like a bebop trumpet player. He was kind of more of like one of the cool school, which meant that it wasn't about playing really loud or really high or anything like that. It was just kind of just being a chilled out guy. And then he got into modal jazz, made some really beautiful albums. I mean, Kind of Blue is the most famous one, but also like Sketches of Spain, a completely different style than he started with. And then, even as time goes on, late 60s, early 70s, he got into what like Jimi Hendrix was doing. And he started making all this, like he went electric, he would have all these effects pedals that he uses on his trumpet and delays and stuff. And he just kept experimenting. And even when critics were down about it, and I mean, jazz critics, they're tough, they're a tough sell. And, they were pretty harsh on him for a lot of his work. But, he just didn't pay them any mind. He just did his thing. And I think that is such an admirable quality for a musician to have, or for any artist for that matter.
You write a little bit about criticism in your book, and it of course makes sense. You put these viral videos on the internet, you're going to get a lot of feedback, for better or worse.
It's a nice way of saying it.
But one of the things I really liked is the way you kind of categorize the different types of criticism that you get.
Well, it's kind of funny. I mean, it's, at first glance, when you look at it, YouTube comments, you're like, this is a mess. Like, what is this, humanity? Like, are these what goes on in people's minds? But, when you kind of parse through it, and you kind of see that it's like this ecosystem. All right. So you got some people that are, you're going to have some people that are just loyal fans. They're going to write nice things no matter what, and they're going to be supportive. And that's how they see themselves. They see themselves as people that are, helping to lift their favorite artists up and stuff like that. And, then on the opposite end, you got people that are just trolls, that they just write things to get a reaction or hope to get a reaction, and, say crazy stuff. It's been well documented what trolls do on online culture. But then in the middle, you got all kinds of different, other kind of archetypes. You got, I kind of label them as professors. They're the people that they kind of want to prove that they know more about an artist than anybody else. So they'll go and they'll research everything, and they see themselves as somebody that's going to kind of shed light on anything, in the comment section, so that they might get into debates with people. They might share fun facts from your Wikipedia page or whatever. And, that's kind of their thing. You got other people that are more critical. They see themselves as critics. They're the kind of people that enjoy picking apart movies or something like that. And they're trying to look for flaws, not because they're just trying to, rag on you or anything like that, but they're just, that's what they do. They like to just pinpoint things that they felt didn't go as planned. So it's kind of this really interesting thing, and you can kind of learn a lot about these individual people. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that they're people. It's like avatars, really. Like, right, our digital selves is not really us, right?
Right. Uh-huh.
It's kind of like when you're in traffic and somebody cuts you off, and you start swearing at them. Like, that's not really you. That's like the road rage version of you.
Well, just on this point of critics and sort of negative feedback, one of those bands that gets a lot of rage directed towards them is Nickelback. But one thing that you write in your book is that you actually have a little bit of a soft spot for Nickelback. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, 100%. In general, I think I have a soft spot for anybody that gets kind of the wrath of the critics or something like that. And I think that a lot of it is just knee-jerk reactions, right? I mean, Nickelback, obviously, if they were the worst band ever, they wouldn't have this kind of following that they do. They have a massive following. They play stadiums, they're enormously successful, and they play their instruments well. They sing well, they do everything right in that sense. It's fascinating that, just being super popular like that will bring out people, so much anger in people. I never really thought much about Nickelback. I didn't listen to them or anything, until we did this Motown tribute to Nickelback project, which basically was a result of a viral news article. There was a petition against Nickelback playing it was a halftime show. I think, was it in Detroit? And it was like the home of Motown. So it's like, why didn't they get a Motown artist or something? And so I thought I would make both sides happy by making this Motown tribute to Nickelback. And it was so fascinating because it became such a debate. Some people really liked the version we did, and they were like, wait a minute, does that mean that I like Nickelback? And then other people were like, no, this is this is blasphemy, combining Nickelback with Motown. And then other people were like, okay, wait a minute. So this song works in this genre. Does this mean that actually Nickelback writes really good songs? And it was just kind of fascinating to watch. I kind of just sat back and watched. And when I do these projects, these kind of mashup things, I like to take it very seriously. I don't like to put any kind of parody in it. I like to do it, to the best of my ability. I'm going to try to do the best arrangement that I can do and highlight the qualities of the song, and at the same time bring something new to it.
You'd said earlier that you really take these cover songs seriously. Can you kind of expand on that point?
Well, I think when you're dealing with coming up with a cover and you have source material that is kind of ridiculous, like Thong Song by Cisco,
Right,
I think the
right.
tendency, the easy thing to do is just milk it for all it's worth and just get a laugh out of it, because there's ridiculous lyrics. Let me see that thong, like how do you make that artistic or something, But what I'm really trying to do is just take these songs for what they are and see what I can highlight in them, like see what elements that exist in the original remind me of other genres of music, or particularly genres of music from the past into like the 40s and 50s and stuff like that. So, to give an example, we did Sweet Child of Mine. This is an example I use all the time because I feel like this was one of the ones that really works and really defines the postmodern jukebox style. Sweet Child of Mine, everybody knows the Guns N' Roses version. It's one of those songs. I believe that there's like a handful of songs you can go anywhere in the world and people know that song. And this is one of them. Now, when you get into it and you look into the lyrics, you're seeing that it's really just almost like a folk song. It has these different verses and then it has a refrain that it does twice. And it's a very old way of writing. And even, the lyrics themselves, Sweet Child, oh mine, it's instead of mine or anything like that. It's almost an archaic phrase. When you kind of strip it away from the heavy metal or the hard rock instrumental and Axl Rose's voice, you could easily reinterpret these lyrics in a different genre. So we wound up doing it as kind of like a 1920s Bessie Smith blues. And I got this phenomenal vocalist, Mickey Braden. She originated this role of Bessie Smith in this off-Broadway show that she's gotten so many awards for and everything over the years. And when we put her voice on it and we put it with the arrangement that I made, which was very, 1920s New Orleans, it just becomes an entirely different song.
Right,
it almost sounds like it could be like a mother singing to her child, Sweet Child of Mine, and so then when I get to do things like that, it makes it really interesting. And I try to do it with no hint of irony.
The quote again is, "Man, sometimes it takes you a long time to sound like yourself." And Scott, I was thinking a little bit before the show, if we're going to start with this quote, we got to think about long time. That means you got to go way back. And you touched on this a little bit before, but can you talk a little bit about your musical upbringing? Were you a piano prodigy in any sense or anything like that?
I definitely was not. Yeah, I took piano lessons as a kid and I hated it. I was about 9 years old, I guess, when I started. And I just couldn't be bothered with it. I wouldn't practice, I would show up every week and my piano teacher would just be like, "What are you doing? Like, why didn't you practice any of this stuff?" And, she was honest with my mom and just was like, "You're wasting your money. Like, stop, bringing him to lessons because he's not practicing." But that changed when I heard a piece called Rhapsody in Blue, George Gershwin, his most famous composition. And, it had the classical sound that I was used to hearing, but then it also had this other sound and I couldn't really identify that other sound readily. And I later found out that it was jazz. Prior to that, I didn't believe that you could play the piano like that. You can make those sounds. And I got really excited by that. And I started kind of teaching myself all these things. And, actually this part kind of ties into the quote, in terms of the process of sounding like yourself. The first thing that I had to do to sound like myself was really mimic others. So I would go to the library and I would take out all these, cassettes and CDs of all these old jazz artists. And I would put the cassette player on my piano or my parents' piano. And then I would listen to a phrase and I would try to play it back on the piano as close as I could. And I would get sheet music whenever it was available, pick it apart and try to learn all the parts, like, see like, oh, this is how they voice that chord, or this is how this pianist plays that one, lick. I really started just by mimicking all these pianists that I heard. And I would just play a phrase that I heard somebody else play on a record or something like that. And I think this is a really common way to start learning an instrument. It really goes back to childhood. When you're learning to speak, you're you're mimicking at first.
Yeah.
You know, you're not stringing together all these complicated phrases or anything like that. You're just kind of repeating things that you heard. And then I started seeing that you could adapt other types of music into jazz. You could roll other styles into this. So I could take a pop song, or I could take like a nursery rhyme, and then you could put it into a jazz context. You change some of the chords around. Maybe you do a different type of left hand or different rhythmic displacement on the figure, and then before you know it, you're turning another song into jazz. And that's where things get really exciting for me. That was kind of the game changer for me.
Pre the YouTube phase, you were doing a bunch of gigs, and you write about doing gigs all around New York as a jazz pianist. And I've always kind of wanted to ask this of like a jazz pianist. Like now you're done shows with Postmodern Jukebox and they're sold out and it's a huge crowd. But when you were a jazz pianist, like at a lounge or a bar or something, I've always wondered, like, do you ever wonder, is anyone listening to me? Do people like the music? When you were more background music, what did it feel like to be more in the background?
Well, I think that one thing you do as a jazz musician is no matter what the gig is, you're going to give your 100% effort. I put as much effort into those background music gigs as I put into anything I do today. But there's a big difference in how many people are listening. I would play at a restaurant and there might be a handful of people there and maybe like 2 or 3 of them were listening, and that would make my day. Like, honestly, if we had one person that was really engaged and applauding after every song and maybe even requesting songs, that would, I would latch onto that. I was like, this is great. This is a good night. Then, other settings, I mean, if you're doing like a wedding cocktail hour, sometimes nobody will be listening to the music, or everybody will be drinking and talking loudly, or they'll do the thing where like, hey, you sound great, but can you turn it down a little bit? Can you play a little quieter? So yeah, I mean, it's something you get used to as a jazz musician pretty fast. And then you just kind of focus on the handful that are your audience. And I think there's a real value to that, because especially if you're doing like a niche project like Postmodern Jukebox, for instance, I mean, it's not for everybody. I mean, it's a certain type of sound, and that's part of, sounding like yourself. You're not trying to make this big mainstream thing where you're not trying to win over 100 out of 100 people. You're trying to win over the percentage of people that would be interested in this kind of thing and just go from there. So, I learned that lesson very early on, that you can't please everybody. Not everybody's going to be your audience, but you can get by with just a few. And at a lot of those wedding cocktail hours, there's great hors d'oeuvres. So you can, if you play your cards right and just get a doggy bag, you can take all that food home and eat for a couple days.
Scott, one of the most interesting parts of your book, your story, to me, is right before you upload one of the first videos to Postmodern Jukebox and it takes off and it goes viral and your career begins. You actually were thinking about doing something else. You've been working as a jazz pianist for a couple of years. You were contemplating kind of getting a real job. You were thinking you might go back to school, or you were going back to school to take some science classes, and thinking maybe you'd be an educator. And you said, in a weird way, kind of having that escape hatch sort of finally freed you to make art. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think prior to that, I was feeling a lot of pressure. I was feeling, as a musician coming out of school and moving to a city like New York City, I felt like I had to make a name for myself as a musician. I felt that I had to demonstrate how good I was or something, and I felt like I had a lot to prove. And it wasn't until I kind of came up with an alternative, way of earning a living, or at least in my mind, a theoretical alternative, before that pressure kind of got released. And then I didn't care as much, I certainly wouldn't have, like, right coming out of school, I wouldn't have done, a silly YouTube video with me playing ragtime version of 80s songs. I wouldn't put that out there when I first got out of school, when I went to New York, because I was trying to be somebody else. I was trying to be a jazz musician. I was trying to do serious stuff that critics would like, stuff that, would get me on the faculty of a university or something potentially. So in a weird way, contemplating going back to school for something completely different and working in a different field kind of freed me up, and it made me take myself less seriously. And I think that was a really valuable thing. And that was something that had to happen for me to have any kind of success. I was a terrible perfectionist. I didn't think that anything that I that I put out was as good as it could have been, or as good as I should be putting out. And that kept me from not really releasing anything. I would have these songs or recordings that I'd work on, and then I'd record them and then I'd listen back. And I'm like, no, that's not right. You know what? I'll wait another 6 months and I'll try recording it again. Maybe I'll be better by then or something like that. And a whole half a decade passes, and I was no longer, 20 years old with no recordings. I was 27 with no recordings.
You call perfectionism a monster, and still overcoming perfectionism is actually one of the things that helped you get Postmodern Jukebox off the ground.
Yeah, and I mean that stuff doesn't go away. I'm still perfectionist about a lot of things, and I've just learned to deal with it better. What worked for me in the early days was, okay, I realized that there was like a fan base that was forming, and I would disappoint them if I didn't put anything out. So that kind of put me between a rock and a hard place. I was like, well, I could be perfectionist and disappoint all my fans, and that I worked this hard to get over so many years, or I could put out something that maybe to me is maybe not my best or subpar, but a lot of people will enjoy that. And ultimately I chose the latter, and I decided to just kind of just put out whatever I came up with. And then I reframed it in a way. I started thinking, well, okay, the point of art is to be authentic and to be honest. And these recordings are honest. When I put out a Postmodern Jukebox track, I mean, we're all in one room when we're recording. We're not doing tracking or anything like that. This is what you see is what you get. This is how it sounded live. And there's an honesty to that. And that became kind of one of the guiding principles. We're not going to try to overproduce things. We're going to put out honest music. And having that principle in place made it a lot easier for me to release things.
But I was thinking a little bit about this idea of like teams and kind of having your unique voice, because Miles Davis, he says it takes a long time for you to sound like yourself. And to me, I kind of think, okay, well, that's like having your individual voice, kind of your own individual aesthetic. With something like Postmodern Jukebox, it's a band, but all of those people kind of have their own voices. It's like sort of their own aesthetic that they have. How do you kind of balance, like, Scott Bradlee, I'm Scott Bradlee and I've got this style, versus working kind of with all these other people and sort of the collective?
Well, that's kind of where the magic takes place. I got my arranging style. I got, my way that I arrange things and produce things. But then you're bringing in all these different artists, all these different singers and instrumentalists that all have their own styles. And then it's that intersection of those two things that makes it really interesting, because I think every successful project is a collaborative one, taking talents from different people and bringing it together. For me, a big part of what I do as a producer and certainly as like a director on things like that is just trying to strike a balance here, trying to maintain the integrity of what Postmodern Jukebox is, but also welcome all these amazing talents and let them do their thing and kind of get out of their way sometimes. There's so many times where a singer will come up with a great idea or an instrumentalist will come up with a great idea, and it's something that just I never had thought of. And it is just perfect, where it sits. So then a big part of just, striking that balance is making sure that, when we're putting together a tour, for instance, that, everybody shines. Every instrumentalist, every vocalist on that stage has something that they're contributing their best self to. So, you're part psychologist, you're part arranger, you're part coach, you're doing all these things. And it makes it really interesting. That human element makes it really fascinating and really fun.
Hey, Scott, Miles Davis says that, it's really important as a musician to kind of sound like yourself. Is that something that you're looking for in new band members, this kind of idea of like a unique understanding of their own voice?
Absolutely. I think that it's kind of like this quality of unforced uniqueness, where somebody steps in and they perform a song and it's them. You just like, you hear them perform and you see them and how they're acting a song or whatever. And you're just like, oh, this isn't acting. This is them. This is really them. They're not trying to be somebody else. They're not trying to be Amy Winehouse, or they're not trying to be Ella Fitzgerald. They're just doing what they do, and it's natural. And I think that that's really the mark of somebody that's an original.
Scott, I feel like you're very lucky to be one of those people who has built a career around sounding like their true selves. And I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing this Miles Davis quote.
Yeah, absolutely. This was fun. And, it's fun to pick apart a quote from one of your idols. I think all of us can can talk at length for that kind of stuff. So this was a good idea. I like this format.
Thanks for listening to Notes on Quotes. Again, I'm Stephen Harrison, and this series is a team effort with audio production done by Jason Cady, transcriptions provided by Sarah Baum of Sharp Copy Transcription. Our theme song is Water and Bridges by Joshua Heffernan, and the podcast cover art was created by the talented Kathy Weller. Check out our website, notesonquotes.com, for the archive of all previous episodes and the print versions of all prior interviews. Sign up to get the notes delivered to your inbox and help support the series. Follow us on Instagram, Medium, and social media at Notes on Quotes. And don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you choose. Thanks again.